My name is Mr. Rodolfo A. Provichado Jr., and I will be your flipped classroom science teacher. Before we begin, I'd like to please grab a pen and your notebooks when you write down important concepts and ideas that are very important for you to understand better our discussion today. But of course, during the course of our session, if there are things that you really didn't understand, I suggest you write those questions down on a piece of paper and you could ask this question during our extended learning discussion at school. So if you're ready, then let's begin. Let us start with the word coronavirus. We all know that coronavirus allegedly started in Wuhan province of China, and this has infected a lot of people. In fact, it has become a global pandemic. Why? Because as we speak today, there are about 80,000 individuals infected by this virus. And one of the symptoms that you are infected by this virus is quite similar to when you get influenza virus, and that is you get cough, you get fever, shortness of breath, and there is a different degree of infection of symptoms for the coronavirus, and this is you will have pneumonia eventually, and this can cause deaths eventually. And actually, there are about 3,000 fatality around the world, and this keeps on increasing. In fact, different world leaders are now on watch of this increasing and alarming spread of this coronavirus. In fact, 4 days ago, the president of Indonesia, President Jokowi himself, confirmed that there were 2 cases of local transmission of nCoV-19 in West Java. And hours after the pronouncement, people from Jakarta or Indonesians all over the country to the supermarkets in order to hoard canned goods and other food materials because of the fear of possible lockdown in case the government decides to contain the virus and to prevent this virus from spreading elsewhere. What I'm saying this is because the virus will be one of our discussion main topic. So it's very important that we know we have the knowledge so that we know exactly what to do when we are infected by the virus, and we know what is the virus even though we can't see them actually. Right, so let's start with how the world or how the organisms begin. Every organism survives because the raw materials are present on the surface of the earth. But when exactly did the earth begin? According to most scientists, which majority believes it's about 5 billion years old. And during those times, the prevailing climate during those times are not suitable for life forms to exist. In fact, life form emerged 2.5 billions after the creation of the earth. And this life form or prehistoric life forms are feeding on what we call the primordial soup. And these raw materials allows them to continue their life. However, during the course of time, climate keeps on changing, and this change in environment, which we call the natural selection, allows the evolution and variation of species. In fact, these variations have led to 7.5 millions of species of plants and animals as of present time, and only about 900,000 are being identified. In Indonesia alone, there are about 300,000 wildlife species, and this is 17% of the total recorded wildlife species around the world. This may be because Indonesia is a tropical country and it's very much conducive for different wildlife species to live. Now, because of the importance of these wildlife species, a branch of science that deals with the study of life, which we call biology, have emerged. It studies how life exists, how living forms behave, so that we may able to benefit from those behaviors of living life forms. For instance, we can use plants and animals for medicines in order to increase our lifespan and to better our lifestyle as well. So, in this particular session, we will be talking about the characteristics and classification of living organisms. In particular, at the end of this chapter or session, you'll be able to know what are those different characteristics of living things, how to name organisms using a binomial system, and how living organisms are classified, and of course, how to use dichotomous keys to identify organisms. Let's begin with the first characteristics. All organisms are able to move to some extent. Most animals can move their whole body from place to place. and plants can slowly move parts of themselves as well. So for instance, a predator moves because they're looking after their food, which is the prey. The prey moves, on the other hand, because they want to save their lives from the predator who is running after them, which makes sense. Plants move in response to stimuli, which we'll be discussing, which we call sensitivity. We'll be discussing on a short while. Their roots move down and their leaves and shoots move upward towards the sun. Next is that living things respire. Now, take note that respiration is different from breathing. Breathing is simply the process of taking in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. Respiration is essentially a chemical reaction wherein it uses oxygen to chemically react with glucose in order to release the energy needed for cellular respiration. And on the other hand, it releases as a byproduct water and carbon dioxide. So respiration is needed in order for us to produce the energy. Next is sensitivity. Remember about movement? Plants and animals move in response to a stimuli. We call that sensitivity. So plants respond to stimuli, including animals as well. Next is growth. All organisms begin small and they get larger over time. They begin adding new cells, and that's how they begin to develop their bodies. And of course, we have different threshold growth limit for plants and for animals. Next is that living organisms are capable of reproducing their own kind. That means when we say talk about species, we're talking about organisms that are capable of interbreeding and be able to produce a fertile offspring. Those are species. That means animals that belong to the same species have those characteristics. Next is excretion. Remember that after taking in the raw materials for metabolism to take place, we also need to release the byproduct because those byproducts are actually toxic to our body. So when we breathe in oxygen, the byproduct of respiration is carbon dioxide that has to move out because too much carbon dioxide concentration can also be very toxic to the organism itself. Okay. Next is nutrition. Of course, all organisms take in the nutrients from their environment. For the plants, they're able to produce their own food, thus they're being called producer. And other organisms, such as humans and other life animals, they are actually heterotrophs, or they're not capable of producing their own food. That's the reason why they're much dependent to other plants and other animals as a source of food. Now, to easily remember those 7 characteristics of living organisms, let's start with M, movement, R, respiration, S, sensitivity, G, growth, R, reproduction, E, excretion, and nutrition. In other words, just remember the word Mrs. Graham. And this Mrs. Graham makes up the 7 characteristics of living things. Now, mostly that we have discussed is flora and fauna. And remember, there are about 7.5 million different species, and only about 900,000 are being identified. So it's very important for us to identify these living organisms, this flora and fauna. And because of the importance of identifying them, a branch of science emerged, which we call taxonomy. This is responsible for organizing and naming the different organisms according to their characteristics. So let's deal with the aspect of why do we need to name them. First, it answers the question, how many known species are there? Secondly, what are the defining characteristics of each species? And number 3, what are the relationship between these species? There was a first attempt which started about 2,000 years ago by this Greek philosopher Aristotle. He's the first person to classify organisms according into 2. And that is what he said, plants and animals. However, there is limitation to this classification, right? Now, before going to that limitation, plants and animals long before are very much known during the time of Aristotle. In fact, plants are also known as autotrophs, and animals are also known as heterotrophs. Autotrophs because they can produce their own food, and heterotrophs, which means they derive their energy from other organisms, which means they cannot produce their own food. Now, however, there are limitations of these early classifications because we can't seem to figure out where to place fungi between plants and animals because they are neither plant nor an animal. How about bacteria, protoctist or protista or protist? And it doesn't show any evolutionary relationship at all. And it's the reason why there has to be a very good way of classifying these animals, these living organisms. And therefore, classification of organisms needs to be established. And in fact, the father of taxonomy is Carolus Linnaeus. To answer the question and to answer the need to categorize living organisms, he devised a classification based on morphology, which means it is based on organisms' form and structure. Two of his major contributions is that he grouped organisms based on a hierarchy of 7 different kingdoms. Kingdoms as as the biggest group of animals. Secondly, he created a scientific naming system called a binomial nomenclature. Now, so why do we need a binomial system? First, common name can be very misleading. What do I mean by this? It means that, for instance, jellyfish is not actually a fish, but seahorse is a fish. Secondly, common names vary by location. For example, this animal is puma. In some other places, it can be called mountain lion. In some other places, it's called cougar. So common names are very much confusing. And the last one, so common names vary by language. For instance, this is snake. In Bahasa Indonesia, we call that ular. So if you happen to go to China, for instance, if you're inside the zoo, you wanted to know what's the name of that animal. If you're talking about common name, you might, not understand what animal is that. But if we speak the same language, even regardless of what places you go, you will be able to understand each other. So this is the importance of having a binomial system. So there are limitations of the early scientific naming. For instance, this red oak, as you see there, that red oak is being described using the Latin name. So Latin is the language of science before. In fact, even nowadays, it's a language of science. So Carolus Linnaeus named this as Quercus follis obtus sunotis cetaceo mucronatis, which means in English, oak with leaves with deep blunt lobes bearing hair-like bristles. Imagine this long, so it's a disadvantage. Having this kind of long description of scientific name is quite hard for us to remember and hard for us to appreciate or engage with these different names. So that's the limitation of the early scientific name. It's quite long and it's quite hard to remember. And then he proposed a binomial nomenclature. Bi means two, nomial means name, nomenclature means naming system, which means binomial means naming system. The first name is the genus, the second name is the species. Both are groups, right? Species identifier, or in other case, we call it as the trivial name. Now, there are rules in following when writing a scientific name. First, you can write it in italics, or it can be italicized, or it can be underlined. However, we need to capitalize always the genus name, and the species name should be all in lower case. For instance, human beings. Okay, our scientific name is Homo sapiens. So the genus is capital H, the species is sapien or sapiens, small letter. Or it can be underlined, same thing, the genus has to be in capital letter, and the sapiens, which is the species, has to be in lowercase, right? So that is how we write a scientific name. Now, Carus Linnaeus, just an extra credit, Carus Linnaeus was not his original name. His original name was Carl von Linné. But because of his contribution to the naming system in Latin, he changed eventually his name to Carus Linnaeus. Just an extra credit, okay? Now, let us review or let us reveal what are those 7 hierarchy of groups that that Linnaeus proposed. First, he proposed that the biggest group should be kingdom, followed by phylum, class, order, family, genus, and lastly, we have the species, right? Again, I repeat that these are the 7 hierarchy that Linnaeus proposed. We have the kingdom, the phylum, the class, order, family, genus, and species. Now, in order for us to easily remember these 7 hierarchy of classification, we just have to remember the word King Philip came over for great spaghetti. Again, I repeat, King Philip came over for a great spaghetti. We have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And among this 7 hierarchy of classification, it is the genus and species that comprises the scientific name or the binomial system. Genus, again, in writing has to be in capital letter, and species needs to be in small letter. So it can be italicized or it could be underlined. Kingdom, we all know, we have kingdom Plantae and Animalia. So later on, we will be learning about different kingdoms aside from Animalia and Plantae. So how does linear system works? So let's take a look of this of the system of Carus Linnaeus. First, we have here the C star. As we go down, we reduce the number of organisms that belong to that particular group. For example, these are all kingdom Animalia because they can't actually make their own food. They're quite dependent on raw materials in their environment. As we go down Chordata, which means they have backbone, and therefore we remove the C star. And as you go further down, Mammalia, which means they have fur, and that means we remove the snake. And as we go further, carnivore, that means they are actually eating meat, so we remove the hair. And eventually, we go down further until such time we'll be able to reach the species name, which is Ursus arctos. So this is how Linnaeus' system worked. Now, the key fact about this classification system is that it is based on characteristic that we can see. So during the time of Linnaeus, there were no sophisticated electron microscope available for Linnaeus dispense in order for him to advance his study. And so later on, scientists have found out that they can actually look internal structure of the organisms. And we call that biochemistry. They're looking on the DNA, the very DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid of each organisms and try to relate their similarities with other species. And because of this advancement, we actually change the hierarchy. Instead of 7 hierarchy and kingdom as the biggest, we actually add one more hierarchy, which we call the domain. Thanks to the electron microscope and thanks to the American biochemist, Dr. Warl Busse, he compared the biochemistry of different organisms. Guess what? He came up with the 3 domains. And these 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria and archaea, they are prokaryotic organisms. That means they don't have true nucleus, while eukarya or eukaryotes, they have true nucleus. So bacteria is, what is good about these 3 domains is that we can relate or link the evolutionary relationship between these 3 domains. So we have eubacteria as part of the bacteria domain, archaebacteria as part of the archaea, and those 4 other kingdoms such as Protoctis or Protista, Plantae, fungi, and Animalia, belongs to the domain eukarya. Okay, so take note, we have domain on top of the kingdom. So let us discuss individually the 6 different kingdoms. And these 6 different kingdoms, they form part of what we call nowadays as modern taxonomy. And this modern taxonomy allows us to see the evolutionary relationship between different kingdoms and between different domains. Now let us start with analyzing the kingdom Archaebacteria. Now the kingdom Archaebacteria, they are unicellular prokaryotes. They are ancient bacteria that some of the Earth's oldest life forms. Some are autotrophic, same with normal bacteria. Some are heterotrophic. They live in extreme environment. For example, thermophiles, these are archaebacteria that lives on extreme temperature. Acidophiles, guess what? These are prehistoric bacteria that lives in an extreme acidic environment. And halophiles, these are bacteria that can survive in extreme salty or concentrated salt solution or environment. So these are kingdom archaebacteria. The difference between archaebacteria and the eubacteria is that eubacteria requires oxygen, but archaebacteria can survive without the presence of oxygen. So eubacteria is also unicellular prokaryotes. Some are autotrophic, some are heterotrophic. They can be found in soil, water, human body, etc. Unlike archaebacteria, again, eubacteria requires the presence of oxygen. We also have the kingdom Protista. Well, these are eukaryotic organisms. They're considered as junk drawer kingdom or odds and ends kingdom because they cannot be classified as bacteria because protists or prototists, they have nucleus. Okay? Mostly are unicellular, some are multicellular. Some are autotrophic and some are heterotrophic. Some acts like an animal, some acts like a plant, some acts like a fungus. So Protista, it is considered as a junk drawer kingdom because scientists don't know where to classify these microorganisms, and thus they're just considered as prototists or Protista. Next is the kingdom fungi. Kingdom fungi is a eukaryotic organisms. Mostly they're multicellular, but there are also unicellular fungi, which we call yeast. They're unicellular. Fungi are heterotrophic, and their main role in the ecosystem is being as a decomposer. They do not photosynthesize. Their cell wall are made of chitin, as opposed to plants that are made of cellulose. Some of them are pathogenic, some are not. When you say pathogens, they actually can cause diseases and illnesses to other organisms. They reproduce by spores. Their cell walls are made of chitin. Let's go to kingdom Animalia. Kingdom Animalia, they are eukaryotic. That means their cells they have nucleus. They're all multicellular organisms. All animals are heterotrophic. And all animals are able to move if it is only during some stages of the life cycle. There are no cell walls, only cell membranes. And that's the reason why our skin are quite soft, right? Because we don't have any cell walls, just like plants do. Kingdom Plantae, on the other hand, they are multicellular organisms. They are autotrophs. It means they're capable of producing their own food because of the presence of what we call the chloroplast. Their walls, their cell walls are made of this very strong cellulose, and these allows the cells, and this prevents the cells to shrink, prevents also water loss, and prevents also destruction from outside factors. Finally, we also have the viruses, which is neither a living or a non-living thing because it did not qualify in any. It doesn't have the complete characteristics as we enumerated Mrs. Gren a while ago. So viruses such as the tobacco mosaic virus that can cause spots in the leaves of the tobacco, and the virus that causes human infection or human, this virus that can cause diseases such as HIV, and we also have influenza virus that can cause colds and coughing, and lately the nCoV-19. The usual incubation period for COVID-19 is about 14 days. That's the reason why if you're suspected of having exposed to individuals who are carriers of this virus, you need to isolate yourselves within this 14 days. This is an incubation period. That means it is the day by which the virus spreads out and can give a significant infection in our system. And that means you can have dry cough, sneezing could be, or headache, shortness of breath, and even pneumonia. So the best way to combat this, well, you have to wear mask. It's better to have protection than not having protection at all. You need to also keep on washing your hands at least 20 seconds. You need to wash your hands. If you can't, you don't want to count from 1 to 20, perhaps you can just sing the song Happy Birthday song twice, and that is approximately about 20 seconds. So you need to wash your hands, top and bottom part, right, for 20 seconds. Of course, you also need to eat healthy foods. So when you are isolated or self-quarantine, you need not to um, expose yourselves to other members of the house. Otherwise, they might also be at risk of being infected, because these are airborne diseases. Every now and then, we need to wash our hands because this virus can just stay on the surface of any of table of any hard objects. Okay, and when you touch them, you'll be able to, it will contaminate your hand, and of course we won't be able to control ourselves touching our face, and that will eventually get in our system and can cause pneumonia. So virus is not a living organism for the simple reason it cannot reproduce by itself. It can reproduce when it is able to get inside a healthy cells and use the raw materials in that cell in order to reproduce itself. That's the goal of the virus. Next, let's try to study further the different phylum under the kingdom Animalia. Now, the kingdom Animalia are divided into two groups. We have the invertebrates and the vertebrates. Vertebrates, these are organisms that have vertebral column or backbones, while invertebrates, they don't have any backbone. Invertebrates are categorized into four. We have nematodes, annelids, mollusks, and arthropods. And arthropods are also further categorized into four. There are actually many, but these are the basic and common phylum under this particular kingdom Animalia. So arthropods, such as myriapods, insects, crustaceans, and arachnids, or spiders. On the other hand, vertebrates includes amphibians, reptile, fish, bird, and mammal. For invertebrates, nematodes, they have thread-like bodies that taper at the mouth in anus. An example is these ascaris that can be found in the human gut. This can grow up to 20 centimeters, and they are parasites because they feed on the foods that we are actually eating. Next is what we call the annelids. They are segmented bodies with bristles. And an example is the earthworm. They are actually segmented worm. They can burrow in order to look for foods. We also have mollusk. These are soft body with no limbs covered by shell. An example is snail. And of course, there are other mollusks with no shells such as octopus. Arthropods, on the other hand, these are organisms that has hard exoskeleton, jointed limbs, segmented body, such as myriapods. Myriapods have long bodies made up of many segments. An example are the millipedes and the centipedes. Insects, on the other hand, they have three body segments, three pair of legs, two pair of wings, and they have antennae. An example is mosquito. Crustaceans, on the other hand, they have two pairs of antennae. An example are crabs. And arachnids are two body segments, four pair of legs, no wings. An example are the spiders. Next, let's talk about animals that have vertebral column. Actually, these animals under vertebral column or chordata, phylum chordata, they are actually classified according to their skin. For example, for amphibian, they have no covering on skin. An example of an amphibian are frogs. Reptile, on the other hand, they have dry skin. An example are lizards. Fish, their skin are moist. Their mucus-covered skin, they have gills and they have fins. And they can actually, they also breathe in oxygen because they are living organisms. They need it for respiration. And birds, an example of fish, okay? And of course, we have also the birds. They have feathers, beaks, and wings. They actually reproduced. Fertilization happen inside, but they need to lay their eggs outside. Okay, an example of this bird. Penguins are also bird, by the way, and ostrich are also bird. Mammal, on the other hand, they have fur, they have hair, and their young feed on the mammary glands. An example is an elephant. And including human beings, we are also considered as mammals. So that's the kingdom Animalia. Now let's go to kingdom Plantae. Kingdom Plantae, such as algae, mosses, ferns, and seed plants. Algae, they have no separate roots, stems, and leaves. An example is a seaweed. Mosses, they have stem, leaves, but no roots. Ferns, they have stem, leaves, and roots, and the spores. So they produce spores as a means of reproduction. And stems, leaves, roots. The last part is the seed plants. There are two types of seed plants. We have the angiosperms and the gymnosperms. Angiosperms are all flowering plants, while gymnosperms are plants or trees that has cones on it. Right? So that's the kingdom Animalia and kingdom Plantae. So how did taxonomists establish evolutionary relationship? In our previous example, there were no evolutionary relationship in that particular aspect. How did taxonomists establish this? And this comes in what we call the cladistics, using what we call the cladogram. Now here, on my left side, we have here the cladogram. So what basically here, this is, the lowest part is what we call the ancestral characteristics. This is something that is common to our ancestor. And all of these characteristics here are derived characteristics. How does this work? So all these animals that belong to this line are vertebrate. That means they have vertebral column. Here, all the animals here on top of this description, bony skeleton, okay, except for the shark. If you go on top here, there are all four limbs except for the ray fin fish. And if you go up higher, all of these animals here, they have amniotic egg except for amphibians, and so on and so forth. That's how cladogram works. Again, cladogram is very important because it allows us to see the ancestral characteristics and what are those derived characteristics common to living organisms. Now, how do we identify the species of an animal? To help us identify the species of an animal, we need to use dichotomous keys. These are scientific tools that allows the user to determine the identity of an item or organism based on its characteristics. Dichotomous means divided into parts, comes from the Greek words, and the keys always give us two choices at each step. And there are rules to follow in making a dichotomous key. And one of those rules is that we need to use characteristics that remain constant. Use measurement rather than terms like large and small. Make the choice a positive one, something is instead of is not. If possible, start both choices of a pair with the same word. Finish the dichotomous key with the item's identity, and if done correctly, let's make this, let's do transfer. If done correctly, you should have one less step than the number of organisms. What does it mean is that if we have 5 organisms to be classified, there has to be at least 4 steps. If there's 9, there has to be 8. If there's 10, there has to be 9 steps, right? Now, let us try to pause this video and try to answer this question on your own. Now I'm going to check your work for this particular assessment. Now I want you to pause the video and continue answering the question. So we have 5 organisms here, A, B, C, D, and E. So you just simply follow the key or instructions. For example, for 1A and B, body is completely or partly covered in a shell. B, body is not completely covered or partly covered in a shell, and so on and so forth. So what is the scientific name of organism A, of B, C, D, and E? I'm going to wait for your answer during our extended learning discussion at school. Now, please answer these questions because I'll be giving extra points for those who can answer the question. By the end of the discussion, now you should be able to know the characteristics of living things using Mrs. Gren, naming organisms using the binomial system, genus, it could be italicized, it could be italicized or underlined. So genus should be start with this big word or capital letter, not big word, but capital letter, and the second name, which is a species or the trivial name, should start with a small letter. Okay. Also remember the different hierarchy of needs. The first one is the domain, followed by the kingdom, and we have the mnemonics for it. How living organisms are classified, and how to use the dichotomous keys to identify the organisms. That will be our session for today, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.